Hi, good evening. This is Meredith Lego, and I'm doing a series of videos on Ascension Science. I am super excited to bring this particular content to you because it was based upon a download of information that I recently received from a variety of different beings, both some beings that I've been working on with historically, but also some new beings that I've connected with. And I actually don't know the names of them, but there's many of them that are coming into giving me some of this information. And I received the data through a download of different images of, as I said, but there was a bit of knowing that came with it. So this particular content is going to build upon a couple of historic videos that I've done, and I would highly encourage you to go back and watch them. But they're going to be building on, and I'm just looking at my notes here, a video that's titled 3.2 called How Polarity is Created in Our Holographic Multiverse. And another one that's called 3.3, which is Polarity and the Cycle of Time. So again, those would be good reference videos to go back and look at after you've watched this, or even to pause this and go watch those first. But basically, the whole premise that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video is basically the mechanics of how ascension actually happens. And it oddly enough, it includes a bit of ascension and descension, but we're going to get into that. But we're going to talk about how the forces, basically the forces of nature, if you will, move energies, which is also the same thing as consciousness. So it moves energy and therefore consciousness through space and time. And so this is kind of a big concept. There's going to be a lot of concepts that get introduced here, but hopefully you'll see how they all come together. So going back to those first videos, the 3.2 and the 3.3 videos that I referenced before, I brought up a particular image that I had received from an ascended master named Hilarion that started to get into the mechanics of how polarity kind of works within our universe, if you will. And again, polarity is just complete extreme opposites of energy. And you know, we live in that type of environment, or we operate in that type of environment in order to help us understand how to learn and to grow and to evolve. So again, you better understand what cold means when you also understand what hot means. You better understand what love means when you also understand what hate means. So those are two extreme different energies, but through that we learn and we continuously evolve our consciousness with the entire intent to lower the entropy of our evolutionary process. And so I'm going to be sharing again a graph that essentially I've built out a little bit more, and hopefully you can see this. But essentially, when I received a particular download, and it came in the form of me seeing it almost as a torus field, but also as a black and a white hole. And at the particular time, I actually had a bit of an out-of-body experience. And I was presented, I was like out in outer space, if you will, out of body. And I was looking at the very top of a black hole, like I was on the event horizon of it, observing it. And there was a massive golden grid system around it. You know, basically energy grids all around it. But essentially that's the introduction to my lesson that would get me into this. But essentially, if you kind of think about this as a 0 point, essentially consciousness moves, if you will, in an infinity pattern. Okay, so these are like how consciousness sort of evolves in an infinity pattern. And every time that we have a particular experience in life, we're going to have that experience. You know, we're going to, first it comes in the form of either it's something that happens to us, or it's a thought that we have, right? We have an intention, we have some emotion behind it because we're excited about it or whatever. Maybe we're empathetic about it, but usually we're excited about some stuff, or maybe we don't even like it, but we have a thought. So it's kind of, it's not matter. It's, you know, in your head, you have a thought. And essentially you go out and have the experience of having that, you action that, if you will. And then essentially you experience it, it comes back around. And then essentially you're able to process your learning from that experience. So that could be, that was a great time. I had a great time with, on that journey, or that really sucked. I don't want to go through that again, whatever the case may be. So you have an experience, you process it, and you're better able to reintegrate that learning within your being and your consciousness, if you will. Okay, so that's kind of the process that's going on, right? And essentially, as we kind of move through time, if we have a particular experience and we haven't sort of learned from that experience, or we haven't resolved or cleared energy from that experience. So let's say it's a bad experience, we keep stewing on it. Let's say, you're an individual, you've had falling out with your parents or something like that, and you can't forgive them, you stew on it your whole life. Your soul, if you will, has the opportunity to learn from that experience. But if you don't, you're going to carry over that energy into your etheric blueprint, into your DNA, and that can position you to go through that experience in the next life. So essentially, when you're doing that, let's say you're at a certain vibrational frequency when you're doing this and you're here, and if you don't clear it, you can keep getting trapped. You keep getting trapped at this level, if you will, right? But if you can learn to expand beyond that, you're going to be able to go up at a higher harmonic frequency, if you will, and start to expand out in your consciousness, okay? So you start expanding out a little bit more and a little bit more, okay? So that's essentially what's happening. And like I said, it very much... this kind of is like a halfway cut off of a torus field, but that's essentially what I'm trying to depict here. And this was presented to me originally by Ascended Master Hilarion, and he called it essentially like the Infinity Road. And, I always understood there was some connection to it, the infinity sign with all this. But what he explained to me is that, a lot of people think about this torus kind of going like this, but the energy is actually moving back and forth. And here's why. So it has to do with the forces that drive polarity. So at the one end of this particular torus field, and keep in mind, in the middle is a point or a speck of energy, if you will. So it can be an atom, it can be a subatomic particle, it can be a galaxy, it can be a human, it can be a dog. So there's some, consciousness source at the middle of this. So it can be quite large or quite small. Now, at the one extreme, essentially, when there's an intention that essentially kind of goes out, it starts as an intention. But essentially what he explained to me is that on one side of this, you're going to have basically a white hole, which is more electrical energy, and it usually takes the form of matter. And if you kind of think about what he's saying is that he also described it as male energy. And that's not to be confused with the gender male, but it's more of the idea that electrical energy usually is an energy that goes out and it creates action. So it's kinetic energy in motion, okay? Now, the other extreme of that is basically a black hole. And if you kind of think about the concept of a black hole in space, it's sucking energy in, right? Now, at the opposite end of a black hole in another multiverse, I guess, or another dimension, is a white hole pushing energy out, maybe a star or sun, essentially. So it's pushing energy out, it's pushing information out. But essentially, that's the opposite of it. Now, that is magnetic energy. Makes sense, right? It's sucking in like a magnet would. And it is essentially anti-matter. So it's the opposite of matter. But essentially what happens is that, you have an intention of energy of consciousness. It gets actioned, it gets pushed out. So it's electrical, it gets actioned in the matter world. And then essentially you learn from that, and then it essentially becomes antimatter because it's not in the matter world. It's more in the mind world or the consciousness world, if you will. So that's essentially what's kind of going on. So these again are the forces. So what I tried to do is write this down. So it's the polarity forces that drive the movement of energy through consciousness and time. Okay, so time is an element within this because, again, your consciousness is sitting in a certain space-time vector, and you know, at any point, depending upon your vibration, so this is kind of one vibration, another vibration, another vibration, another vibration. So again, depending upon your frequency, if you will, depending upon your frequency will dictate your placement here or here or here, you know, so that's the whole concept of it. So let me, so this is kind of a fundamental concept, and I built this up in, again, my videos 3.2 and 3.3. But now I want to introduce another concept that I downloaded that ties to this. So essentially, the whole premise of this particular channel has to do with ascension and the mechanics of ascension, if you will. And so if you kind of think about ascension of consciousness, if you will, now I'm going to be bringing up a different graph. You've got a starting point of consciousness. And usually in our world, we kind of think about it as the first dimension, if you will. And then essentially, at least in the kind of harmonic universe that we play in, you know, the highest, at least that we're shooting for, at least right now, is 15th dimensional consciousness, which is at a certain higher, you know, density level, let's call it. So in the first kind of dimension or first density, that is actually the way that we see it play out in our world, if you will, in terms of matter. It would be like the telluric matter. So that would be the actual planet itself, rocks, you know, heavy metals. So that is, you know, again, rocks, the earth, heavy metals, it has consciousness, or they have consciousness just as much as we do. They're just operating at a different level of sentience with their consciousness, but it has consciousness. When you kind of move up the ladder, plants have consciousness as well, and actually it has been proven that they have the ability to sense into their morphogenic field and to the fields of other beings, and they can sense things that are going on in their environment. And, you know, I'll maybe make a video about Clive Baxter, who is, I think he worked for the CIA, but he essentially developed the entire process for doing the lie detector test. And through that, he was testing on plants and got reactions out of them when essentially he was thinking about harming them. So they sensed it and they started to react, and he was able to get reading on the lie detector test off the plants. But essentially, so, you know, when you move up into like the second dimension consciousness, so that would be, again, like plants, animals, you're moving into second density. Again, then you move into third dimensional consciousness, humans, if you will, fourth dimensional consciousness, and so you're kind of going up. So you're going from more of a solid matter state, if you will, into more of an etheric state. So that's what's happening when you're ascending. Now, I probably should have drew the graph that way because we kind of think of moving up. So I apologize for that. But, you know, just it's the idea of like ascending your consciousness. Okay. Now, obviously, the opposite of that is descending your consciousness, which I probably should have drew like that, but you get the concept of it, right? So you're starting at like a higher etheric antimatter consciousness state, and essentially kind of, you know, moving down into more of a solid material form. Now, again, thinking about this particular concept right here, you know, you're moving from where consciousness is actioned in a particular dimension and density, right? So we have a thought. That thought has no density to it right now. It's just in our heads, right? But it's energy. And then essentially, as we action it, it starts to move more into the material form, possibly through our taking it from sort of potential energy to kinetic energy, if you will. So same concept here. Now you kind of ask yourself, gee, we are all on a path to ascend. Why would anything want to descend consciousness? But essentially we are in the process of doing that. So let me explain that a little bit more. So let me find my notes here. So essentially, there's a process that goes on, which is called, it's essentially a fusion of consciousness that goes on. And in many ways, it kind of ties to the concept of the atom fusing, or the fission process, where you're kind of pulling things apart. So fusion is bringing things together. Fission is creating two separate pieces from one, if you will. And so within the fusion process, so imagine you've got consciousness. Some of it is descending, if you will, and some of it is ascending. So essentially, we as beings have multiple, a multi-dimensional self, right? So we've essentially got our first dimensional self, our second dimensional body. We've got our kind of physical body, right? Our physical body. We've got our emotional body, our mental body, our etheric body. We've got a soul, an oversoul. I think it's a avatar, a Christic body, and a monadic body. Okay. And what's happening during the ascension process that we are going through is that our personality ego construct, which is, a part of this kind of physical, emotional, mental body, that is ascending. But at the same time, what we're doing is we're reaching into the higher levels of our dimensional frequencies, our sort of soul and oversoul and monadic, bodies or stations of identity, and they are descending at the same time. And the idea isn't necessarily that we poof away, so when we ascend, it's not like we poof away into nothingness. As we ascend, that higher levels of consciousness is merging, if you will, is fusing, if you will, with the lower levels of consciousness to become one fused multidimensional being. But essentially, there's awareness of all of those layers of consciousness going on at the same time. And, as you start to do this, obviously, we're in a point where we're tapping in more into those essentially higher layers of consciousness at those higher frequencies. And as we do, we'll have, we'll be able to experience more of the etheric parts of our consciousness. So that could be, let's say, moving more into seeing other lives, because, as you start to do this, time, coming back here doesn't necessarily play out. So as you're kind of tuning into different layers of consciousness, you have the ability of seeing space-time points here, but you can also see them here, right? So you're just getting more of an understanding of the vastness of what your consciousness can be experiencing at different space-time vectors. Essentially, that's what's going on. So essentially, as I mentioned, this is kind of fusing together. Now, what's interesting when this happens is that obviously, like now, we probably have a good read of understanding the feelings associated or the health or consciousness of our physical body. We're trying to master our emotional body and our mental body. But again, as you're ascending up, you're mastering and connecting more with your soul, your oversoul, and the other higher stations of identity. So essentially, when this, another way to think about this is also creating what's called the Hieros Gamos union. So it's interesting that, essentially the spiraling, the ascending and the descending spiraling of consciousness essentially ends up becoming a two-dimensional tetrahedron, if you will, or a Merkaba. Now, you can kind of think about this as a union, if you will, but it's a union of your electric and magnetic forces. Also a union of your masculine and feminine energies. So when I say that, It's a union of actioning, logic, taking energy and taking intention and putting it into movement. So, taking an idea and actually acting upon it. And then your feminine energy, which is being able to intuit and sort of pull in information from the field around you. So, we're at the point now in our kind of evolution of consciousness with a lot of the energies that we have coming in that's changing the makeup of our DNA, is that we have the ability to tune in more into the field and essentially get more downloads of information that can come to us. So we can attract more easily things that we want in our lives. We don't necessarily have to keep, driving up a hill, if you will, in order to get the things that we want and want to create as visions in our life. The other thing is blending together the matter world along with the antimatter world. And so, I'm experiencing a little of this happening a little bit more, where I'm able to connect into different aspects of, let's say, my soul or oversoul. And then, another way of obviously is, you're merging or kind of balancing the ascending and descending aspects of your stations of identity. So that's essentially what's happening during this process. And so the last point that I just kind of wanted to point out is that, as I mentioned, this is a fusion. And actually, when I was getting the download of this information, I actually received the idea of fusion versus fission. And that, interestingly enough, as this was happening, I was seeing in my mind's eye, or being downloaded with information around sort of like the expansion of, let's say, a galaxy. So if there was originally sort of the concept of the Big Bang, there was a sort of a fusion out of energy, and then essentially it starts to collapse back in on itself, and then it fuses back out and starts to collapse back in on itself, if you will. So that gets into this concept here, right? So, you kind of fuse back in, and then you collapse back, or you expand out, and then you collapse back in. You expand out and then collapse back in. And that's essentially the cycle that goes on. And so right now, we're at a phase in our species where we're beginning to go through more of a fusion of those multi-layered dimensions of consciousness and integrate all the stations of identity, so that there's better awareness of all of them. So it's, again, not that you're losing your physical self. You're certainly letting more go of the ego, but you can achieve an understanding and connect into more of your monadic presence within your physical third density body, if you will. But this fusion essentially is at-one-ment, if you will. So you're achieving an at-one-ment, or an atonement, if you will, or harmony. So it's a harmony of those forces between, as I talked about, the matter, antimatter, the electrical, magnetic, the feminine and electrical, the feminine and the masculine energies that are going on. So they are at one, or atoned with each other, and they're in more harmony. So a lot of big concepts that are coming together. I was really excited that, when I was receiving it, because it was really bridging together a lot of different lessons that I had been receiving along the way. But as I was getting them, I was sensing new teachers who were coming in, who were helping me to sort of bridge it all together. So with that, I hope that has certainly helped you with your understanding, and helping you and empowering you on your kind of path through your ascension journey. So with that, I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and I love you. And we'll look forward to sharing more learnings in future videos. Thanks. Bye.